Welcome, everyone. So we have a few absentees this evening, but thrilled to see that the Zoom is working. So everybody knows that if they can't be here in person, you just click on that little link and it'll allow you to participate remotely. So why don't we begin with a word of prayer? God of grace and everlasting glory, we give you thanks for bringing us together once again. As we gather, we do so knowing that you are waiting for us even now in the sacred scriptures of long ago. We ask that you open our hearts and prepare our minds to receive your wisdom, and we may live it fully and faithfully as disciples of the risen Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen. All righty, so we have a lot to cover this evening. And the readings were quite extensive. I will admit that. It's not usually that extensive, but this evening we're going to be moving into what is known as the historical part of the book of Genesis. And as I said last week, we did Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, all part of what is referred to as the prehistory. And so
look through others just to make sure.
Okay, so all right. So the session tonight, the class tonight covers basically from Abraham on, and it's the patriarchs. And so let's just quickly go through a few things here. And the words, the names and everything, you know, Abraham, obviously, Beersheba, the southern part of Israel. Bethel. Remember last week I said that if a name or a place in Hebrew ends with the letters EL, that is a reference to the root word for God. And so we know therefore that Bethel means something God. Okay, and B-E-T or B-E-T-H in Hebrew is house. So Bethel literally means house of God. And so that brings us to another famous B-E-T-H. Can anyone think of another place in Israel that begins or has the letters B-E-T-H? In Bethlehem, of course. So we know that B-E-T-H is house. So Bethlehem means house of something, and it literally means house of bread. Yeah. Birthright. In ancient Judaism, the oldest son got a double share of the inheritance. That was his birthright. That's going to figure in the story of Jacob and Esau. Canaan is the name of the promised land. Circumcision, a sign of the covenant. Covenant says is a bonding together of God and God's people. Edom is basically part of what would be Jordan today. Esau was one of the twin brothers, and I'm going to go through the genealogy so that it hopefully will all make sense. Hagar was basically a concubine of Abraham, and when Abraham and Sarah quite elderly, no children, and so Sarah says, take Hagar as your wife and bear a son, and she does that, and we'll talk more about that. Haran is where Abraham was originally from. Isaac, one of the the son of Abraham and Sarah. Ishmael is the name of the son born to Hagar and Abraham. Israel is the name that Jacob received after he wrestled with the angel. And then you have Jacob. Let me see, anything else? Joseph, another one of the patriarchs. Leah, Jacob's first wife. Rachel, his second wife, his favorite. Rebecca, and Sarah, Shechem. All righty. So one of the things I will say is we look at the patriarchs and we see them as holy people, okay, called by God. However, a very dysfunctional family to the max. And so what I want to do is to help put it all into perspective is I'm going to give you a bit of the confirmation class that I do for the Old Testament. There we go. So Genesis tells the story of creation and God's relationship with the Jewish people. The father of the Jewish people was Abraham. And so God says to Abraham, go from your father's house and your kindred and to this promised land, and I will give it to you and make of you a great nation. So that's what Abraham does. This is the covenant. Now the Lord said to Abraham, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation. So Abraham went as the Lord had told him to the land of Canaan. Then the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. Okay, this is known as the Abrahamic covenant. God covenants, creates a special relationship with Abraham, a sacred relationship. And God's promise to Abraham is a life with many descendants and also the promised land. And this is the land of Canaan, and this is where Israel is today. This is the Gaza Strip. Oh, by the way, I'll interject here. I'm not going. I got word on Monday that they've canceled the tour. I wasn't completely surprised, but I also quickly decided, that I wasn't going to do a staycation in place of a bucket list trip that I've been looking forward to. So I got in touch on Tuesday with Brenda Sutherland. On Wednesday, I got in touch with her daughter Samantha, who works at a travel agency, and she put me in touch with someone at their agency that specializes in South America. And so 1 week from today, instead of pyramids, I'm going to Machu Picchu. I'm still shocked that I was able to put this all together in like 48 hours. So anyway, no worries. I'm not going to be in this area. By the way, this is where the Israelites would have been as slaves of Egypt. This is the land of Goshen, and the Sinai, Mount Sinai is way down here. This is the Gaza Strip up there. And then we were going over here into Jordan. So we weren't going to be near the hostilities, but what happened, I'm sure, is that they didn't have enough people who were still willing to go. So only fools like me. This is the land of Canaan. This is the promised land. Okay. So as I say, Abraham and his wife Sarah, childless, they're beginning to think, what's going on here? God, you made us a promise, and Abraham is 100 years old and Sarah is 99. Let's just say they were quite elderly. They were beyond the normal childbearing years. And so this is where Abraham is told by Sarah to take Hagar as his concubine, and she gives birth to a son, Ishmael. Gold star to anyone who can tell me who Ishmael is the father of, what people? Islam. Yeah, so the Arabs, okay, which is just what makes this whole ongoing feud so frustrating, because they're really of the same family tree. And so what happens is Sarah becomes jealous So Hagar is sent out into the wilderness along with Ishmael. God promises to make of Ishmael a great nation as well. And so Sarah and Abraham then have a son, and his name is Isaac. So basically, the Jewish people see Abraham as their patriarch through Isaac. Arabs see Abraham as their patriarch through Ishmael. Yep, they're part of the same family tree. Okay, and so Abraham and Sarah's son named Isaac, and goes to, as I said last week, names of places and people have a meaning in ancient Judaism. And so what does Isaac's name mean? Yep, means he laughs. Because when God tells Abraham that Sarah's going to have a son, he laughs. And so God says, okay, that's the way you want to play the game. You're going to name your son Isaac. Okay. And Isaac has a son, has twins actually, Jacob and Esau. Esau is the oldest. Jacob is the youngest. They don't get along very well. What's interesting is Isaac and his wife Rebecca play favorites. Isaac's favorite is Esau. Rebecca's favorite is Jacob. And so there's a famous story where Esau comes in and he's starving. Jacob has made a pot of porridge, and Esau says, I'm starving, give me something to eat. And Esau says, I'm not going to give you any unless you give me your birthright. And Esau, apparently not all that bright, gives him the birthright. And so that's the start of discontent between the two brothers. By the way, backing up, I said a very dysfunctional family. God tests Abraham to see if Abraham really is devoted to him. And what does God tell Abraham to do? Yeah, he said, basically says, take your son and sacrifice him. And child sacrifice was very common among some of the peoples of the land of Canaan at that time. So we're going to come back to the story of the sacrifice, the potential sacrifice of Isaac, because it's a story that troubles a lot of people. Just out of curiosity, anybody here ever troubled by this story? Yep, okay. We're going to come back, and I won't give you an ironclad guarantee, but I am pretty sure that I can explain the story in a way that will alleviate some of your concerns about God saying, go sacrifice Isaac. Okay, so back to Jacob and Esau. Esau sells his birthright. And then the other thing is there's a blessing that the father would give when he was getting close to the point of death. And so Jacob and Rebecca conspire to cheat Esau out of the blessing. And so what he does is Esau apparently is very hairy. Jacob wasn't. So Isaac's eyesight is really bad at this point. And so Isaac summons Esau for the blessing, and Sarah puts a sheepskin over his arm, and he goes in, and Isaac says, you know, you sound like Jacob, but you feel like you're Esau. And so he gives Jacob Esau's blessing. Esau is furious at this point, and he basically threatens to kill his brother. Told you, very dysfunctional family. So Jacob goes running for his life. He ends up with his uncle Laban, which is his mother's brother. Okay. And I'll come back to Jacob. So Jacob then has 12 sons, okay? What is the significance of the 12 sons?
12 nations.
12 tribes of Israel, exactly, the 12 tribes of Israel. Yep. Okay, and by the way, how many disciples did Jesus have? Yeah, was it a coincidence? No, Jesus deliberately chose 12 disciples because he was sending a message that his followers were going to be a new chosen people. And a chosen people that would share God's love, not just with the Jewish people, but with the whole world. So Jesus deliberately chose 12. Okay. And anybody tell me who Jacob's favorite son was?
Joseph.
Joseph. Yep, Joseph. And another gold star. What did Jacob give Joseph to show his affection for him? The coat of many colors. Yep, coat of many colors. Oh, I'm sorry, this is out of order. Okay, we'll come back to the coat of many colors. So one of the readings was, yes.
This is happening about 2,000 years before the birth of Christ. Is that correct? Or is that?
Yes, yes, no, that is about right, okay? Because one of the ways that we're able to, I keep cutting my hair off. One of the ways that we're able to get a time frame for all of this is that we know that the Exodus from Egypt took place during the reign of the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II, and that was about 1200 BC. And we know that the Israelites were slaves in Egypt. Anyone want to guess? What was the game show where Price is Right, high and low, you know, you need to say high, low. So throw out a number, Hazel, about how many years do you think the Israelites were in slaves in Egypt? 100 years. Higher.
Well, I'm very confused about the slave part.
Okay.
Because they were there for a long time.
Yep.
Because of the famine. And it looked to me like they were there only here one generation, but I read some, they were there 340 years.
Higher. Yeah, higher. We'll get to that. Yep. Thomas, throw out a number. More than, what'd you say? 347, I think. How long were they slaves in Egypt?
500.
Say again?
500.
Less, lower.
Yeah, right.
450? Lower.
425.
Lower.
14.
Higher.
$1 427.
427, lower.
420.
That's it, 420 years. They're slaves in Egypt for 420 years. So back to Jacob. Jacob wrestles with an angel. Okay, and this is the point at which his name is changed to Israel. Okay, and Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of day. When the man saw that he did not prevail against Jacob, he touched his hip socket, and Jacob's hip was put out of joint as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for the day is broken." But Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And he said to him, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jacob." Then he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel." Again, you have the EL. "For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." There's a psychological interpretation of what's going on here. Remember, Jacob has lived a shady life. He's cheated his brother. He's been rotten to his brother, and he's gone to his uncle Laban's, and he works 7 years so he can marry what he thinks is Rachel. But then on the wedding night, he pulls the veil back and he finds out that he's not getting Rachel, he's getting Leah. who wasn't the prettiest. In fact, she's called cow-eyed, which basically means that we believe that she was cross-eyed. Okay, so Jacob then has to work another 7 years for Rachel. Then he leaves in the middle of the night with Rachel and Leah and takes some of his uncle's belongings and everything, steals basically from him. And he's going back home, and he knows that he's going to have to make amends with his brother. And this is when he wrestles with the angel. It's the night before he knows that he's going to be once again face to face with his brother. And so he's conflicted about it. They are reconciled, but I've always liked this picture of Jacob wrestling with God, or some parts of the story it says a man, some parts of the story it says an angel. And once again, these are the different oral traditions that we've talked about, because the priestly, I think, is the one that would not or could not envision God actually interacting with a person like that. Okay, so sometimes it's an angel in the story, sometimes it's a man. And all right, and so the coat of many colors is what Jacob / Israel gives Joseph. And I always show this to the confirmation class because they're so young, they have no idea what this is. Are you all familiar with this? Really? Andrew Lloyd Webber. He also did Phantom of the Opera. He did this musical when he was in college. The play is Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. I actually mentioned this in a sermon a few weeks ago. Who plays Joseph in Broadway? Johnny Osmond. Yeah. All righty. So Joseph doesn't help his own cause because he's kind of full of himself. And so he goes to his brothers and says, hey, guess what? I had a dream. And there were all of these, what do you call them? Bushels? You know, when you take wheat and you kind of tie it up. So, okay. And he said, all of your bushels were bowing down before mine. And so the brothers aren't happy. In fact, in that song, at one point they say, and now this coat has really got our goat. And so they really get all bent out of shape. And so I gotta keep stopping. So Jacob / Israel sends Joseph out into the fields to find out how the brothers are doing with the sheep. And they see him coming. And what did they do in their jealousy? Did they run away from home? They threw Joseph into a pit and left him there to die. See, burned Joseph's coat of many colors, sold him as a slave. And he guesses. Which one?
Sold him as a slave.
I'm sorry?
Sold him as a slave.
Sold him as a slave, yes. Yep, yep. Actually, say again?
They threw him in a pit and then decided.
Yep, so the answer is actually B and D. They originally throw him into a pit. They're gonna kill him. But then Reuben, one of the 12 sons, convinces him not to do that. And so then there's a band of passing Ishmaelites. Once again, back to that name, Ishmael. And so they sold him as a slave, and Joseph then ends up in Egypt. Okay, and Bill, you said you had a question about Joseph in Egypt, or did I not hear that correctly?
Well,
Yeah.
Yes and no.
Okay.
I mean, from what I read, right?
Yeah.
He goes to Egypt, he becomes
Mm-hmm.
fairly prosperous.
Yes,
because of the dream that the Pharaoh had.
yep,
And
Yep.
7 years of prosperity and 7 years of famine.
yep, yep.
And then they had 7 years of famine and the kingdom, I don't know how far they.
Yeah, so basically, the answer to your question, because if I'm understanding you correctly, we have Joseph and then suddenly it's like time to leave Egypt. Okay. And so actually, why don't we look at this? This will be covered again next week, but if you would open your Bibles to Exodus. The very first chapter of Exodus. All righty. And it begins with all of these names. Okay. And then verse 6 says, then Joseph died and all of his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so the land was filled with them. And then this is the key verse 8. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Okay, so we don't know exactly when that king / Pharaoh came into power, but it's one of the pharaohs down the road. So that is what tells us that the Israelites, after Joseph, were still in Egypt for quite a while. They got quite acclimated, but then they had a change of fortune when a pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph, which is basically saying he had no connection, no obligation, sense of obligation to the Israelites, and that's when they become slaves. And we'll go over that more next week, but that's the key right there, that there was a pharaoh, a king who arose who did not know Joseph. Okay, and let me see, we're almost done. Okay, so Joseph is now in Egypt. He ends up as a servant in the house of a Egyptian general by the name of Potiphar. Okay, and just when Joseph didn't think things could get any worse, Potiphar's wife decides that Joseph is kind of cute. And so she wants to have a little fling with him. Joseph, being a righteous man, refuses. And so what does Potiphar's wife do? Yep, she accuses Joseph of basically raping her. Potiphar is furious. Joseph ends up in prison. What gets Joseph out of prison? Somebody mentioned it, the dreams. Yeah.
Okay.
So Pharaoh has a dream. And in the dream, he sees 7 fat cows followed by 7 skinny cows. Nobody can tell him what the dream means. So fortunately, there's somebody in Pharaoh's court who knows that Joseph has this gift of interpreting dreams. And so Joseph is summoned, and what does Joseph tell the Pharaoh the dream means? Yes.
There's a famine coming and he needs to store food for the famine, so the people can make it there.
That's right. 7 years of bountiful harvest. That's the 7 fat cows, followed by 7 years of famine. And so Joseph says, you know, Pharaoh, if you're smart, you'll store up all the food you can during the 7 years of bountiful harvest. So you'll have food for everyone when the famine hits. And sure enough, the famine hits. And who comes to Egypt looking for food? The brothers. The brothers. Joseph has his opportunity now to get his revenge, but that's okay. That's all that. So again, to recap, Abraham, father of the Jewish people and the Arab people. Abraham through Isaac is the father of the Jewish people, through Ishmael is the father of the Arab people. And so Isaac, the son, means he laughs. And then we have, after Isaac, we have Jacob and Esau. And then after Jacob and Esau, we have the 12 sons and Joseph. And that's all of this patriarchal in a bit of a quick rundown. So,
That's
Oh,
really-
yes.
It's interesting because I studied Italian Renaissance art in Merrimack, and then I went to Italy, and there are different depictions of this story of Abraham and Isaac on the doors of these cathedrals. That
Yeah.
People are just mesmerized by the art, and they don't touch it, they're just in
Yeah.
parts of it.
Yeah.
You can see like different tours coming up and
Yeah.
talking about the story, so
Yeah.
people who don't necessarily read or can't read, they tell the story, and it's amazing the
Yeah.
awe.
Mhm. Yeah, some of the as you were talking, it made me think of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, which is just indescribable. It really is awe-inspiring. So let's let's look at the story of the sacrifice of Isaac. Okay, and that is when is that? Why am I not finding that? Oh, it's Genesis 22. There we go. Genesis 22. And I'm going to suggest that maybe we read this story and we each take a verse, and it would be nice to hear the different translations. And if somebody does not like to read, that's absolutely understandable. So we're at Genesis 22, verse 1. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. Max, if you don't mind. Second verse. Oh, I'm sorry.
Sure, I was reading.
Yeah, okay.
Kerygma.
That's all right. Why don't we'll come back to you.
God said, and take your son, your only son, your beloved Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah.
Yep.
Where you are to offer him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I shall point out to you.
Early the next morning, Abraham saddled his donkey, took with him his son Isaac and two of his servants as well, and the wood that he had cut for the holocaust, set out for the place of which God had told him.
Yeah, David.
Then on the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw a place afar off.
And
He said to the servant, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back for you, come back to you.
Bill.
Abraham did Isaac carry the wood for the sacrifice, and he himself carried a knife, live coals for starting the fire.
But-
As they walked along together.
Okay, yeah. By the way, does anybody think it's adding insult to injury that you're potentially going to sacrifice the kid and you make him carry the wood? And Hazel.
And Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, my father, and he said, you're my son. And he said, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the offering?
Yeah. And Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together. And if you'd like to, Max.
When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar on top of the wood.
Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to kill his son.
The Lord's messenger called him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham, yes, Lord, he answered.
In verse 12. Yep.
And he said, lay not thine hand upon the lad, neither do thou anything unto him. For now I know that thou fearest God, seeing thou hast not withheld thy son, thy only son from me.
Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its thorns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of a son.
Abraham named that place, the Lord provides. And even today, people say, on the Lord's mountain, he provides.
And the angel of the Lord called unto Abraham out of heaven the second time.
Okay, yep, and said, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son. In verse
I
17,
will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies.
All nations on earth will bless themselves by your descendants, because you have obeyed my command.
Abraham then returned to his servants, and they set out together for Beersheba, where Abraham made his home.
all righty, okay, so let's dive into this. Questions, comments, and conundrums about what's going on here.
Is there a reference to that he was going to sacrifice his son and God sacrificed his?
Yep, there is a school of thought that says that this is a parallel between what happens on the cross. God sacrifices his son, and you have Abraham almost sacrificing his son. I don't know as personally if I would read too much into that. I think it's kind of a nice coincidence. One of the things we have to be careful of, by the way, and I see this happening sometimes, is there's a tendency for Christians to look back into the Hebrew scriptures and Christianize them, okay, rather than let them stand on their own validity, okay? And so this is an instance where it's sort of an attempt to Christianize the sacrifice of Isaac by comparing it to what happened on the cross. Personally, I would leave this at its face value here, but good connecting of the dots. Yep. Yes, David.
Why do you think they do that?
Why, what?
Why do you think they do that?
That some Christians attempt to read the New Testament to the Old Testament, because I think it validates their faith in some ways. Personally, I don't feel a need to do that. I'll give you another example where that's done, okay? Where the story we talked last week about Adam and Eve and eating the forbidden fruit, and then the punishments are doled out, and the snake, the serpent is told that, you know, he'll bruise the heel, but the serpent's head will be crushed. And there are some Christians who say that's a reference to the conflict between Jesus and Satan. I don't see it. I don't see it. And you know, we have to let, again, what I said last week is one of the first rules of biblical interpretation is you go with what was going on at the time and you interpret it for how the people at that time heard it. And then you can take it forward and say, okay, this is what it has to say to us today. And so, for example, the scripture Sunday is Deuteronomy and Moses on Mount Nebo, which I was thinking to myself, God's got a sense of humor because I was supposed to be there this coming week, and here's the scripture for Sunday. And so, you know, I look at what happened then and I say, okay, this is what it meant for the Jewish people. And based upon that, what does it mean for us? And to find out the answer to that question, you'll hear it Sunday in the sermon. But again, we need to let the scriptures of the Jewish faith stand on their own, okay? So why does God tell Abraham to sacrifice his son? And why does Abraham do it? Or almost do it?
It's just his faith.
Because his faith, okay? But you know, that's a kind of faith that reminds me of what happened at Jonestown. Everybody remember that? Jim Jones, and you know, people had all these faith, and so they drank the Kool-Aid with the cyanide or whatever it was in it. You know, there's such a thing as blind faith. So does that what God wants? Is, you know, to say, okay, I'll do whatever you want, God, even if it doesn't make sense to me. Does God want blind faith? I don't think so. It's not the faith, the relationship that I want to have with God. And so here is the key, I think, right now. Okay, so let's start with verse 7. So they're on the way up the mountain, and Isaac says to his father Abraham, I see the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for a burnt offering? And what does Abraham say in response to that question?
God himself will provide the lamb.
Yeah, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering. Okay, so here's where I think the faith of Abraham comes into play. It isn't because he's going to blindly kill his son. The whole time, Abraham knows who God is, that God is a loving, good creator. And so I believe that on the way up the mountain, that's the key verse. That all along, Abraham knew that God wasn't going to make him go through with it. That God would provide the lamb for the sacrifice. And I think that's where the faith of Abraham comes into play, is that he knew who God was, and he knew that God would provide the lamb, and that God would not actually make him kill his son. So I may be playing linguistic games here, but that's the only way I can make sense of it. Because
Waited till the very last minute.
what's that?
I waited till the very last.
God waited till the very last minute, and that's the testing of Abraham's faith. Okay, waiting till the very last minute. Because you think about it, going up the mountain, Abraham could have said, you know what, I'm not doing this. This is ridiculous. I waited for this son for 99 plus years. Well, actually 100 and almost 101 years. I'm not doing this. Okay, he could have said, come on, Isaac, we're out of here. But he didn't. And I think the reason why he didn't do it is because he knew that God would provide the lamb for him. And that's exactly what happened. And that's why the name of that mountain is Moriah, because in Hebrew it means God will provide. And I think that's, you know, this is where we take the meaning for back then and we say, okay, what does it have to say to us? It has the same thing to say to us. God will provide. Okay, not always in the way that we expect it, not always in the way that we want it. You know, sometimes people say, you know, why doesn't God answer my prayers? And sometimes the answer is God is answering your prayer, and the answer is no. And you're just not listening because it's not what you want to hear. But God always provides. I had a nun once tell me that, you know what the prayer is that God will always, always answer? It is the deepest need of your heart. Okay. And God knows what the deepest need is in our hearts. Okay. And there is a difference between what we need, what we really need, and what we really want. You know, we use those two words interchangeably. And I always tell the story, my friend who owned the restaurant down in the Cape, he had an elderly woman who would do food prep. And I'd go down sometimes in the summer and help him on, you know, a Saturday. So every once in a while, Dottie, her name was Dottie, and she was a smoker. And so at a couple points during the morning, she would say, oh, I need a cigarette. And I would always say to her, Dottie, no, you want a cigarette. You don't need a cigarette. And so I think that is the thing, is God knows what our deepest need is of our heart. And that's the prayer that always will get answered. Now, there's another aspect of this story that shows you how the two faiths, Islam and Judaism, and the two, quote, races are intertwined. So the name of the place where Abraham takes Isaac to sacrifice him is known as Mount Moriah. Okay, that is a place that is near and dear to Jews. Does anyone know where Mount Moriah is located in the Promised Land? Jerusalem. It is in Jerusalem. And on Mount Moriah was built the temple that Solomon built. Okay. That is the Wailing Wall. I've been there. And by the way, in Judaism, it is not known as the Wailing Wall. It is known as the Western Wall. Does anyone know how it got the name Wailing Wall?
But Orthodox Jewish prayer is so simple.
Yep. So essentially what would happen is Westerners would see Jews going to the Western Wall, and they would be praying to God and praying for the restoration of Israel, the kingdom and everything, and they get quite emotional. And so there would be weeping. And so it got the name, the Western Wall. By the way, so the first temple was built by Solomon. The second temple was built when the Jews came back from exile in Babylon. Okay. And then there was a third temple. The third temple was built by Herod the Great. And he did it thinking it would endear him to the Jewish people. It did not. And in fact, a story I tell, two stories about Herod that show how evil a man he was. The first is that Herod actually had a number of his sons killed because he saw them as threats to his reign. And so the historian Josephus wrote that there was a saying that it was safer to be Herod's pig than to be Herod's son, because he killed his sons. The other thing that Herod did was he knew he was despised. So he left orders that when he died, his soldiers were to round up some of the leading citizens of Jerusalem and execute them, because he was determined that when he died, there would be some tears shed in Jerusalem. That's the kind of person he was. So the third temple was destroyed when the Jews rebelled against the Romans in 90 AD. This Western Wall is the only part of the temple that was left standing. The Romans literally leveled the city of Jerusalem and the temple, and this is the only thing that was left. And so you go up a little walkway and you're on what's known as the Temple Mount. That's where Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac. Now, to show you how interesting it can get, and I just lost my page. Where is it? I had it all set and the clip came out. Hold on as I go quickly to see if I can find it. Wait a minute, I think it was. Oh, here we go. All right. So this here is Jerusalem looking from the city to the east. Okay, this here is the Mount of Olives. Okay, I was in Israel for 2 months many years ago. I stayed at Hebrew University, which is the mount next to the Mount of Olives, Mount Scopus. And this is the Dome of the Rock. It is sacred to Muslims. Okay, the Western Wall, the Wailing Wall, would be just this side. Okay, and so this was built on the site where it is believed in the Islamic faith that one night Muhammad went to heaven on the back of his horse. And when he returned to earth, the horse landed right here. And Christians cannot go into the Dome of the Rock anymore. When I was there in 1978, you could. And there's a big rock in the center. That's why they call it the Dome of the Rock, because it's built over this rock where Muhammad supposedly came back to earth after he ascended to heaven. And it is the rock on which it is believed that Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac. So you can see how enmeshed all of this is. Jews and Christians now are not allowed on the Temple Mount, mainly because it is created as Islam has become more conservative. It has led to all kinds of conflict on the Temple Mount. And actually, a Orthodox Jew would refuse to go up onto the Temple Mount. Anyone know why? Because remember, this was a temple, and the temple had different courts that would bring you closer and closer to what was known as the Holy of Holies. And the Holies of Holies is where the Ark of the Covenant was kept before it disappeared and during the Babylonian captivity. And so, anybody know what was in the Ark of the Covenant? The 10 Commandments. Okay, and that was in the Holiest of Holies. So that was where it was believed that the essence of God dwelt. And no one was allowed to go into the Holy of Holies except the high priest, and he could only go into the Holy of Holies once a year on the Day of Atonement, which Jews celebrate today as Yom Kippur. And he would go into the Holy of Holies and make this sacrifice on behalf of the sins of the people. Because we don't know, and no one really knows where exactly on the Temple Mount the Holy of Holies was located, Orthodox Jews will not go onto the Temple Mount because they're afraid that they might accidentally step onto what was the area where the Holiest of Holies was located. And so this is the Dome of the Rock. Just to this side is another mosque with a silver dome called Al-Aqsa Mosque, which, believe it or not, is the third holiest site in Islam behind Mecca and Medina. And so once again, you have these two faiths so enmeshed, that it's sacred to both of them. So, all righty, we got a few minutes left. Any other questions? I want to make sure I answer any questions that people have.
Pastor, it's safe to say that the Muslim control for the Temple Mount.
They do. They do. I'm not sure the exact setup, but it is a Muslim holy site. And it was originally before, so when the United Nations created the State of Israel in 1948, they created a Jewish state and an Arab state. And Jordan, Syria, and Egypt immediately attacked. And the whole West Bank and this part of Jerusalem was going to be part of the Palestinian state. Before that, it was a part of Jordan. And so Israel took over the West Bank, and this is known as East Jerusalem. And it's tricky. I don't know how they're ever going to resolve it. Actually, they almost did. I think it was during Reagan. They had a comprehensive peace that they could have signed. But unfortunately, Yasser Arafat, who was president of this PLO at that time, walked away from it because he wanted all of Jerusalem. And, of course, the Israelis said, no, because they have the other section of Jerusalem. So anyways.
Was that the negotiations that Jimmy Carter?
I'm not sure if it was Carter or after Carter. I know that Menachem Begin, who was the premier of Israel at the time, that's when he signed the peace treaty with Anwar Sadat. This was after that. This is somewhere down the road, and I don't remember if it was during Carter. I want to say it was during Reagan, but wouldn't swear to it.
Reassurance to know that God goes before you when you are looking at like Isaac and Abraham and the pilgrimage up the hill where he doesn't have all the answers, but he's just trusting that God has gone before him and
Mhm.
prepared.
Yep. Yeah. So God always has a plan. We don't always know what the plan is, and sometimes it's hard for us to understand the plan. But faith tells me that, that God always has a plan. I tell the story that in retrospect, I now know that this is where God wanted me to be before I even got here, because I did a bike ride from Maine to my parents' house when I was an associate pastor up there. And I didn't make it the full, I only made 105 miles, ended up in a cemetery. And then 6 years later, I'm here, or not 6 years, probably about 4 years later, I'm here in North Reading, and I'm driving down Route 62, and I get this deja vu feeling, and I'm thinking, why is this all seeming familiar to me? At that moment, I was driving by Riverside Cemetery, and I looked to my right, and all of a sudden I realized that's the cemetery that my bike ride from Maine to my parents' house ended umpteen years before. So is it a coincidence that my bike ride ends in the community where I'm going to be called to be a pastor, whatever number of years later? God always has a plan. God always has a plan. Not always maybe as spectacular as that, but God always has a plan. And that's what I think is where Abraham shows his faith, because he's going up the mountain and he knows, God promised me this kid. It doesn't make any sense that God would play games like this and say, here you go, yanking the kid back and sorry, no more kid. I think that going up the mountain, when Abraham says God will provide a lamb for the burnt offering, that Abraham knew that God did have a plan and that he wasn't going to have to sacrifice his son for that. All righty.